Hi, and welcome back to Tacks, our video series on taking your ideas and putting them into action. I'm Nicola, the founder of Up With Community, a practice for getting in touch with our personal power for change. And I am here today with Arabella Perez. Arabella is someone that I have had the honor of learning from for, I think, about the last year and a half. And that learning has just been bubbling up in my mind so much that I wanted to bring you here to talk about it. Arabella is the clinical faculty at UNE School of Social Work. She is the coordinator of the Trauma-Informed Certificate here, and she's a national consultant on trauma-informed healing and healing communities.
Thank you.
So Arabella, tell us a little bit more about what you're up to in the world before we start talking about organizational trauma specifically.
Well, I'm up to a lot of different things, but I would say primarily the focus of my work is around trauma-informed care and spreading awareness and education about what it is and what it isn't. Not just to providers out in the community, but also to healthcare professionals that are currently in training, so that we really can focus both on upstream as well as downstream issues, and making sure that all providers know this information as soon as they're out of school and then while they're out there practicing in the community. So I think I would say what I'm doing a lot of is just training both here at the university as well as out in the community.
Yeah, that's great.
So.
That's great. Well, Arabella, I sought you out because through my work at Up With Community, I was going into a lot of systems of people where I could see the hurt that was there. And often people talked about it as, well, this person has this problem, or this person is acting in this way. But I could see that in some cases, it wasn't always about individual behavior or individual experiences.
Right.
There was something collective that was happening in the system. And I was just so curious to learn about your work on organizational trauma and organizational healing as it pertained to how do we heal while we're learning, and so that we can learn. So tell us a little bit more about what is organizational trauma.
Yeah. Well, I think I would first start with just sort of giving a foundation of trauma theory.
Great.
And that when we think about organizational healing, organizational trauma, organizational resiliency, we have to recognize that organizations are made up of people. Yeah. If we were made up of robots, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But we're made up of people, so you're not off when you say that we often sort of point to the other, because that's just our basic instinct, right? But recognizing that organizations are made up of people means that we're going to bring our own personal narratives to work with us. And trauma theory helps us understand how the body processes and metabolizes the impact of trauma.
Okay.
So what happens, whether we're talking about individual trauma, historical, community, intergenerational, is that there is some narrative there that each of us carries. And some folks are a little more out there with the narratives, others less so. But we'd be hard pressed to say that we're not impacted by trauma, whether it's our own or others that impact us. So trauma theory provides us a perspective to understand how we manage that, how our brains manage that, the whole idea of fight, flight, freeze, the way that we become dysregulated, the way that we process information, the way that our amygdala gets overly activated so we get into that place of strong emotion. So knowing trauma theory allows us to be grounded in recognizing that nothing's really wrong with us. Things have happened to us. And we bring that to the work that we do, and we play that out in organizations. And then organizations begin to adopt not only the narrative of the individuals in there, but then they create their own narrative. And they get impacted by what's happening in the community. So when I think about organizational healing, we first want to think about the concept of trauma and trauma theory and how that helps us destigmatize and also normalize what's happening.
That was such a key question that you introduced me to last year. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. What have you seen by using that framing instead of what's wrong with you? What do you see if that opens up with a group of people?
Well, I think it opens up an opportunity to feel empathy, not just for others, but for myself. So I'm able to recognize for myself, my story isn't about something that's wrong, but it's really about an injury. I mean, systems are set up that either you're bad or you're sick, you know. Trauma-informed really means that you've experienced an injury and that you have the ability to heal. So framing it in that context allows me to seek out those opportunities and to be open to those opportunities for healing to happen. And that's where empathy builds up, and being vulnerable as well. Brené Brown talks about vulnerability. So when I think about this, I think about the idea of what happened to you and also what's right with you allows you to experience vulnerability in a way that's healing and not about shame.
Experience vulnerability in a way that is healing and not about shame.
Yeah.
Ooh, I really love that. I love that. Because in that vulnerability is where we can learn.
Absolutely.
And this is where I think your work and my work intersect, because often I'll go into places that intellectually they say they want to learn, but there's so much emotional reaction, body stuff in the system that learning can't actually happen. Correct. It can't take place. So let's talk a little bit about, if that's our baseline understanding of trauma, how do you define organizational trauma?
So, it's interesting. I was thinking about this earlier, and I thought to myself, because I'm all about the somatics and what's happening in the body. And I would say to somebody, first of all, feel it, because you likely are feeling it. Yeah. This is likely is when you know that you just don't want to show up to work, and you don't want to respond to that email, or you don't want to meet with that supervisor, you don't want to deal with that colleague, When you begin to feel those symptoms, then you likely can pause and say, what's happening here? All too often we call that burnout, and sometimes it is burnout, but oftentimes it's not burnout. It's because there is something that's toxic in the workplace that needs to be addressed, and for whatever reason isn't being addressed. And I'm not looking to lay blame on an organization, because sometimes organizations don't know what they don't know. So they don't allow themselves an opportunity to sort of pause and really feel what's happening, and then allow themselves to be vulnerable. So it's not just the individual being vulnerable, but it's the organization being vulnerable to having these conversations. So often what I first see are those individuals that are experiencing those symptoms, and then the further I converse with individuals, what I'm hearing is really a breakdown in communication, a breakdown in boundaries and roles and expectations and transparency, and then you begin to connect the dots, and then as you connect the dots, you're like, oh, this really is about a narrative. So it's not just the individual's experience, but it's an entire narrative, and I'm part of that narrative, and the organization is also part of that narrative. So that's often what I see in situations like that.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about what you just shared is organizational trauma can appear for lots of different pieces, right? Sometimes there's a breach of values, or there's a loss of an ED, or there's a loss of a funder that leads to a major budget gap that leads to unexpected layoffs. Right. All of these different pieces that we just consider the run-of-the-mill of a life of an organization can lead to organizational trauma if they're not dealt with in a healing relationship way, a relationship-based way. And I think that that's what I often see in organizations where I have a hypothesis or I suspect there might be some organizational trauma, because ultimately I look for the organization to come to that awareness themselves, right? Is that there's some story that has led to a narrative of hurt or isolation or pain, and we're living that story every day at work.
That's right.
And then what I notice is folks will say, oh, well, we see the symptoms of people aren't coming to work, or people aren't scheduling properly, or we're not tracking properly. And so then we think, well, let's just fix it with more process intervention.
Exactly.
And then we get in this cycle where the process intervention almost makes the original pain get deeper and deeper, because now we're just digging a hole. What are some of the things you do to help folks first become aware of this?
Yeah. So, it's interesting as you were sort of talking about this, and what you were describing is what I call those technical solutions to really what are adaptive issues. So, and of course it's going to make it go deeper, and it's going to make it go underground, and then we begin to, over time, lose a sense of history, of time and space. Alexithymia comes in, and that's a word that's really about not even knowing what our feelings are anymore, like not knowing how to even label our feelings.
So I'm saying that word and feel numb.
Right, feeling numb, feeling completely detached from feeling and from experiences, and then that behavior gets so ingrained over time that it's really challenging. It's probably even harder to come in at a point where that's been happening for quite some time versus when it's earlier. But regardless of when you intervene, sort of coming in there and first, again, just normalizing the experience, allowing agencies and organizations to know that this happens to everybody. And as we do that, making sure that we're also not assigning blame necessarily, but understanding that it also is just a function of the work that we do. We call it the parallel process. So if we're community organizers, if we're nonprofits, we're working with communities that are also impacted by their own trauma and toxic stress narratives. So we're going to parallel that. We're going to experience that. So just sort of recognizing that, and then as we recognize that, really taking an opportunity to sit and begin to see our role in what I call trauma reenactment. Because so what you just described is reenacting the trauma. We're reenacting it. And we're really good at doing that. We're really good at reenacting. We repeat our history over and over again. Like the old adage, we need to know our history so we don't repeat it. And that's what I say to organizations is, well, let's talk about your narrative and let's map it out here and let's describe what it is. And then once we do that, let's look at the places and the roles that different people filled. And often there's a reason for that. I mean, it's a way of protecting. So if I'm going to be in that rescuer mode, it's because I'm protecting. So I don't want to label it as bad. I just want to label it as it is. So how do we sort of begin to identify how those roles served us and how they no longer serve us?
Yeah, and that's why so much when I'm exploring what the narrative is of an organization, I have to ask them, what is your conflict resolution process? Do you have one? What is your decision-making process? How do you check in on how decisions have been made? Because we often think of the narrative as being the relational side. Like, how are we when we're in a meeting or at lunch? And we don't realize, like, a lot of that reenactment is happening in some of these process things that we don't even realize aren't functioning properly.
Right.
So, like, one of my questions is your performance evaluation punishment-based?
That's right.
Like, do you have a supervisory culture that is about, it's my job to police the people under me, right? And people say, well, no. And then I'm like, well, do you do this, and this? And then they're like, oh, yeah, we do, right? So people don't always see the ways that they are enacting punishment or policing with each other, sometimes even before the trauma happened.
Yep.
And then the trauma happens, and those behaviors are now then making everything worse. So as we're talking about the trauma and not looking for blame, we also have to look at what are the other habits that are not helping us heal and that are keeping us from healing. And something you said really resonated with me, because I think so many of the client jobs that I go to really come down to this question of, do people want to be free? Because sometimes when I see groups that have been reenacting for so many years, I'm like, why didn't you leave?
I know.
Or what's going on,
Yeah.
How do you relate to that? Like, when you're sitting with people that have brought you in, because some part of them knows they need you, but there's some other part of them that hasn't yet totally decided that they want to do the work yet.
So there's two things I want to touch on, but the first one, though, is to that point that you're raising. There's an anonymous quote in a book that I read often, and the anonymous quote is from a trauma survivor, and the quote is, "I miss my trauma." And there's something about recognizing or not recognizing, and what will I replace it with? And maybe I don't know anything else but this, So taking that away, experiencing that loss and grieving that loss, in many organizations, that's one of the issues. It's loss and grief. So not recognizing losses and having a process to really grieve those losses. So it makes it even harder to think about, I'm going to miss my trauma. They may not call it that, but they'll miss that because that's been their way of relating. That's been the role they've been in. So I'm always really careful about that, because I'm not looking to take something away from you, but using motivational interviewing, getting folks to recognize, how does it serve you over time? And does it serve you? So if the organization's not changing, you may have to make a decision that I'm the one that needs to leave then, So that's my first response to that part. And the other piece that you were saying early on that I loved hearing you touch upon is when you talked about, performance evaluations and supervisory relationships and sort of systems in place. That to me are the trauma-informed principles. So when I think about organizations and doing this work, what I then want to do is obviously get to that place of brain science and understanding the narrative and that trauma reenactment, but then I want to unveil these are these core principles, 6 of them, that you really can ground yourself in as an organization. And what you just touched on is one of them, which really is about trust and transparency. You know, knowing that I am going to have a feedback process that helps me to be a better, you know, employee or a better provider, you know, developing relationships with my supervisor that are trusted, where the roles and responsibilities are really clear and they're delineated, and I know what's expected of me and what's expected of them. I mean, these are all the pieces that to somebody on the outside they might just think, well, that's just running a good organization. And I would say, yes, and from this trauma-informed perspective, I said we really need to tend to these principles to make sure we're creating spaces that are safe and trustworthy and empowering.
Yeah. I think that hits the nail on the head, because I've been saying a lot this week, I don't know why, that when there's a vacuum of intention, both our good and our bad or useful or not useful habits will take over. Right? And it's when those not useful habits, or when those status quo habits of discrimination, exploitation, extraction take over, you know? So it's really like, how do we bring that intention to this? And not just relegate it to, well, that's a nice to have, but I gotta get the work done, and you know, and understand that you're not gonna actually get any work done until you address this. I mean, that's the deeper piece. So we're going to put a link to the trauma-informed principles on the video so that folks can take a look at that. But if someone's watching this video and they're thinking like, oh, I might have organizational trauma in my organization, is there one like article or place or action you might call them to just say, after that first thought, what's the next step? Yeah.
So there are definitely some great websites out there.
And we'll put some in the video.
And SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, has a link to several guides they've created on trauma-informed care. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network also has a link to a variety of guides. And some of the guides are even agency-specific, like homeless shelters or working with female veterans. You know, if you really want to dig deep into a specific population, those resources are available. And as I provide those links, I can also, and there's some literature out there and some books that have come out recently that specifically are focusing on organizational trauma using these core principles that I've described. So it's just a different way of approaching organizational healing, and of course it's one that resonates with me because it's really grounded in trauma theory, and I find like you can't argue with trauma theory because it's a well-established theory, you know. So I really can use that to help folks understand and to sustain the gains, because that's also the issue. So if we can do that, we can get them in a place where they'll promote that healing and growth, and they'll sustain it over time.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I know people can find you here at UNE. That's great. And you can find the rest of our videos over at YouTube at our Brass Tacks page. Thanks a lot, everybody.